Before we start cross stitching the pattern, we're going to do some practice stitching, which is why if you've got a workshop kit, you will have this little piece of fabric. If you don't have that, you can just use the corner of your Aida square, because generally we work on the center and these corners will be cut off. So grab your strand of 3799, which is the slate grey colour, and separate out two strands. So to separate out the strands, what we are going to do is pinch the bulk in one hand. In this case, I'm pinching them in my left hand, and in my right hand, I am pinching the two strands that I want to separate out. And then just gently tug them. Now, you may find that they knot up or they get stuck, like this has got stuck. I know there's a bit of a knot forming there. So in that case, what I'm going to do is just gently tug the bulk of the strands, so the other four strands down, and that'll separate them out. So the key here is not to knot things up, because once you get knots in your thread, they can be difficult to get out. So once you've separated out your two strands, and just smooth them out so that they're nice and even. Then grab your needle and thread the strands through the eye. Just going to even those out a little bit. Now, in terms of your needle position, you always want to keep a little tail. And so as we work up the strand of thread, this little tail here will be constantly shortening. And the reason for that is we only ever want to leave two strands of thread in the fabric. If we don't move our needle up, what's going to happen is that this little tail is eventually going to get caught in our stitching, and we're going to have, instead of having two strands for each half cross, we're going to have four, and it's going to get really bulky. So what I suggest that you do is position your needle about a third of the way down the thread, and then as you work, what you want to do is keep pulling it up that tail so that little tail keeps shortening. Okay, now once you've threaded your needle, grab your practice piece of fabric of Aida, and so we're starting from the back. There is actually no front and back with this fabric, so you get to decide which is the front and which is the back. So what we're going to do is just choose a spot, any spot, and push our needle through one of the little holes from the back to the front. And you want to make sure that you don't pull the thread right through. You want to anchor this little tail of about 1.5 to 2 centimeters with your finger. Okay. Now just a little quick explanation about cross stitch. So essentially what we are going to do is create a series of crosses. So you can complete full crosses, like do it across a square, or you can complete a series of half crosses in a row and then go back and complete them. I like to do it row by row rather than square by square. So if we look at our fabric, imagine this is the hole that we came up in. What we're going to do is go from the top hole down to, so the top left hole to the bottom right hole. And then we're going to come up again at the top left hole down to the bottom right hole. And we'll keep going along that row as far as we need to. And then to reverse it, we just go from the top right to the bottom left, and the top right to the bottom left. So that's cross stitch. It is really simple once you get the hang of it. All right, so let's do this on our fabric. So So we've got our fabric here, and like I said, I've come up, this is where I've come up, so I want to stitch down in my bottom right hand corner. So I'm going to push my needle through, and I'm still anchoring that little tail with my finger. I don't want that little tail to slip through. So I'm pulling my thread through. So that's my first half stitch. Now I'm going to flip this over to the back. So remember, this is the top and this is the bottom. So I've just come through the bottom. When I flip it over, this is the bottom is going to become the top. But that, that's neither here nor there. So what I want to do with this little tail is anchor it under my next few stitches. So I'm going to, so you can see it's kind of just sticking out there. My stitches are going to be working this way. So I'm working from left to right. So I want to push this tail down so that when I do my next start my next half stitch, which will be starting here. So like I said, this is upside down, but I know that this little hole here is the top corner of my next square. And so if I look on the other side, you can see my needle is coming up in the top of that square. So I'm just going to pull my needle through, and you can see I've got this big loop, and this little tail fits under that loop. If I pull that tight, that stitch anchors that tail. Now I'm going to come back to the front and I'll do my next half stitch. So going top left to bottom right. So these are directly next to each other. We're not leaving any gaps in between them. Okay, let's do another anchoring stitch here. So we're going up and over this tail. And flipping back around to do another half stitch. I'm going to do one more anchoring thread or anchoring stitch. So up and over. And now I'm just going to grab my scissors. So I've got a thread snips. You can just use a small scissors, and I'll just trim that so that it doesn't get caught in future stitches. Alright, so I'm going to do 5 stitches on this row. I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, now I'll reverse it to complete the crosses. So instead of going top left to bottom right, we're going top right to bottom left, so opposite. So the number one rule with cross stitch, or really the only rule with cross stitch, is that all your bottom stitches should be in the same direction and all your top stitches should be in the opposite direction. So if your bottom stitch is going top left to bottom right, all your bottom stitches should go top left to bottom right. And then the opposite, so top right to bottom left for your top stitches. Now what you can't see is that I actually use this finger to help guide where I'm stitching. So I usually hold that over the area that I'm stitching, because what it does is it shows me where my needle needs to go. And the other thing it lets me just check and lets me feel is if there are any knots. So sometimes your thread can get knotty and tangled. So if you're aware of it and you just use your fingers to feel the back of your work, you can generally find them and get them before you get too far with your stitching. So we've got 3 more top stitches and then we've finished that row. Now there's just one more little trick that I want to show you. If I'm starting my next row, if I'm not starting directly underneath, I can still continue with going top left to bottom right. However, if I'm starting my next row directly underneath, I'm going to have a problem. So if I went top left to bottom right, you'll notice that this stitch just pulled out, and that's because the top left of my square underneath is the bottom right of my square on top. So instead, what I'm going to do is just reverse the order. So rather than going top left to bottom right, I'm going bottom right to top left. It's exactly the same stitch, we've just reversed, basically just reversed the corners that we're stitching. And now if I want to keep going on that row, I'm just going to keep going top left to bottom right. As you do more, you can vary it, but it's good to get into really good habits with this. Alright, so I'm just going to reverse that. And that is cross stitch. It is really simple. You will get faster the more you do, so just keep practicing. And to be perfectly honest, I think, you know, as with anything we do for the first time, you'll probably think your first project will look awful, but your second will be better. Your third will be better than that. It is a skill that you need to learn. Well, you don't need to learn it, but if you're doing it, it's a skill to learn. And the more you do it, the better you'll become. So that's cross stitch.